One thing that you notice when it comes to our contemporary age, or with many of the current forms of social media, is that whenever a political event occurs, whenever a thing occurs which has political ramifications, the narratives themselves surrounding the event at times feel more real, so to say, than the event itself or the thing itself which occurred. And what I precisely mean by this is that the arguments that tend to occur around the event aren't necessarily what occurred itself or the things that happened, but rather it's more so about the narratives that are constructed around it that are the center, they are the locus point for those arguments. For example, you see in debates about immigration, the thing itself or the event itself doesn't actually really matter, whether, let's say, a white person or a black person or an immigrant or a Muslim does something or they commit a crime or they say something that's wrong perhaps. It's not necessarily even the thing itself, but rather how it plays into certain political narratives. Of course, in a lot of postmodernist circles, you have the idea of simulacra, as Baudrillard put it. And, one of the implications is that the kind of 4D abstraction of the event as portrayed online is more real, or it feels more real than the thing itself that actually occurred in the real world. And that's because of, first of all, the mass scale, the mass production of social media, where information about an event or the narratives regarding the event can travel across the world, and people will form opinions based on the narratives regarding certain events, even if they are not familiar with the context of the event itself. And so what you end up getting is debates regarding the narratives surrounding the event rather than the thing itself. And this can be quite destructive in many ways. For example, instead of us sympathizing with the victims of a crime and us trying to come to terms with the evil that facilitates these crimes, instead what we get is the projection of certain narratives onto the event, or rather how these events can be used to further facilitate certain political narratives or certain dialectics, so to speak. I think, we've all seen this in recent events in the media and recent things that have occurred in the past few weeks. But, you see that, for example, people will argue for or against immigration if an immigrant commits a crime. And somewhere between all of that, the people themselves who lost their lives, they just go completely under the radar. There's no actual importance placed upon their suffering. Or, for example, the lives of so many other immigrant peoples who lead productive, successful lives, who are law-abiding citizens, that goes completely under the radar. Or, for example, we should use this to just collectively kill a whole population of people. And I think personally, this is one of the biggest issues with ideologies in general, or with these kinds of meta-narratives, or simply just political narratives, in that they, in many cases, end up leading up to, they end up causing a kind of collective guilt mentality. And I've talked about this in the past, where inevitably, because of the technical nature of ideologies, in that it justifies itself within its own system of thought, it inevitably can lead to the collective guilting and at times collective punishing of a whole population of people based on the actions of some of its members. And this can be true of various different ideologies at times, whether they be political, spiritual, whether they be secular or religious, whether, they be more philosophical or abstract or more realist at times. And of course, if these ideologies or if these ideas are applied on a political level and certain governments take these ideologies or these ideas to their logical conclusion, they can cause some of the worst acts of tyranny of all. And it's not even the case that these ideologies explicitly are advocating for this collective guilt mentality, I'm sure most people, whether they believe in any kind of ideology or any kind of philosophy, would obviously condemn the suffering of innocent people in any case or in any supposed situation. But inevitably what happens is it's not an explicit thing, but it's a very implicit thing with these ideologies, where if you take the ideas or the self-justifying system of thought within these systems to their logical conclusion, you end up getting that kind of collective guilt narrative, or you end up getting that attitude of demonizing a whole group of people at times. But furthermore, somewhere within the battles of these narratives, the battles between these ideologies, genuine truth gets lost. Because sometimes, what happens is it's not necessarily about truth claims beyond a certain point. It's not about seeking some genuine understanding of reality. More often than not, it simply devolves into this kind of partisan politics, or this kind of partisanship, where we are arguing on the basis of what ideology we identify with the most, or what system of thought we agree with the most. It's never truly about, in many cases, trying to understand the world as it is. For example, different schools of thought, let's say, different ideologies, different systems of thought, will argue over certain principles. And at times what they may not acknowledge is that the way that they understand these principles may be flawed, or both of what they are arguing for is correct, and in reality the different principles or the different ideas that they are arguing for are in reality not in actual contradiction, but they are the ones who are applying those ideas in such a way that necessitate that supposed contradiction. And I think coming back to, for example, something like immigration, in reality, there are systemic issues, there are systemic causes, both on a social level, also on a personal level, also on an ideological level, or on different fronts, which cause things like immigrants to commit crime, whether they be socio-economic, cultural, political, ideological. But there are also things which cause the native populations of these respective countries to commit crime. There are also things which cause crimes between the members of these different communities and within these communities. So it's not so simple as we can just collectively guilt and demonize one whole population of people for the crimes their ancestors may have done, or for certain religious beliefs or religious practices they hold, or just collectively demonize them on the basis of the crimes of some of their members. And even with things like religion, look, with organized religion, you can understand that its excesses, its extremities, and the over-bureaucratic nature at times of institutionalized religion can lead to that kind of dogmatism at times. However, dogmatism is not exclusive to religion. In reality, you can observe dogmatism amongst secular ideologies, and even on a very practical level, even if theoretically they don't agree with this, they do display this kind of tribalism that latches itself on to identifying with these political ideologies or these philosophies. And in the way that they are very aggressive in their discourse towards others, in the way that they demonize those who are not part of their ideology or their group. The same, in a practical sense, even if not in a theoretical sense, occurs in terms of dogmatism with these groups as well. Look, in any case, whatever philosophy or ideology it may be, you can always understand that if you emphasize certain principles as essential parts of reality, and whoever denies them is X, Y, and Z, it can lead, maybe on an abstract level, but also on a very real level, when you follow that to its logical conclusion, to the demonization of the other, quote unquote. But in any case, it's important to understand how the narratives that are constructed around certain events can further facilitate these narratives, can further facilitate the dialectics between these different narratives, and how, the narratives themselves at times can feel more real than the event itself. And this is a kind of law that I would suggest, that there is a fundamental law, there's a fundamental rule to be considered here, that at times the narratives surrounding the event itself are more real or just as real as the event itself. And one must be careful to observe the narratives that are constructed or manufactured from an event that may facilitate certain dialectics, or may be used in a certain way to push certain things in a certain direction. For example, on a political level, certain narratives will be constructed in order to sell certain solutions that may act as controlled proposition or opposition, that may facilitate or may direct anger or outrage in a certain direction. And that may simply be the next step in another establishment or another plan of the elites, so to speak, or another kind of status quo which simply maintains these broader power structures and doesn't actually address the systemic and structural causes of the issues that we face.